At the studio with Kitchen Theory, we have Catherine Flood, Print Curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum, London, and curator of the exhibition Disobedient Objects, which was on, when was that, Catherine?
That was in 2014.
2014, and the current curator of Food Bigger Than the Plate, and wonderful exhibition at the V&A that's currently going on today. We're going to be discussing Food Bigger Than the Plate, food waste, the role of food in art, and the idea of eating in museums. Catherine, thank you so much for coming to the studio. It's great to have you here with us to share your expertise in the world of art and gastronomy. How's the exhibition going at the V&A? What are people taking from this?
I think the word that we're hearing most is sort of thought-provoking,
Awesome.
inspiring. It is definitely an exhibition that looks at the kind of major global challenges around the food system, but it does it in a way that shows that there's a huge, massive creative energy focused on that, and kind of no lack of great ideas. So I think people are finding it a positive experience. I think initially fairly surprised to see a show like that at the V&A.
Well, why are they surprised?
I think it's not immediately obvious what the connection is between food and art and design, especially as it's a show that's looking at kind of contemporary practices.
Sure.
It's fascinating because the V&A is full of objects that are related to food, but we've collected them because of their style and their form and their beautiful decoration and what they say about design in that sense. And we've much less often told food stories about them. So it was a chance to bring in a few historical objects and look at them from the perspective of food, but really the focus is on how contemporary artists and designers are working with chefs and scientists and farmers and communities to radically rethink how we produce and consume food. So I think for a lot of people, the type of work on display, it's not what they immediately think of as art or design. And I think that's really interesting.
No, it definitely is. So what was the initial spark that brought this to the V&A? Because I was fascinated when I heard about this exhibition, and partially because there are lots of food exhibitions that I've heard of around the world and that I've been to and spoken at, but to see an institution like the Victoria and Albert Museum bring in food was, for me, kind of this next step in gastronomy, that it's really... Cuisine and gastronomy in many respects have been considered as art, but mostly that kind of haute cuisine, very high level.
Yep.
And kind of that idea of gastronomic artistry. But this is looking at food, kind of removing the culinary and chef part and really looking at, as you said, the kind of cross-disciplinary collaborations, looking at messaging and artists using food as a medium for expressing their ideas. And I thought that was a brilliant kind of indication that if an institution like the V&A are bringing this in, that it's really kind of gaining traction in a way, this idea of food as art.
Definitely. So I think the inspiration for the show was actually twofold. One is, I very much believe that museums are great places to have conversations and think about the future of where we're going as a society. So I think they are important places to have debates, and art and design can be very good at making that feel accessible and engaging. But also, I think any exhibition starts from just seeing really great, really interesting work that you want to give space to. And as a design curator, I was just starting to see so much interesting work happening around food that was very kind of critical, that was moving from food as a commodity to thinking about it as a system. So it was really, wanting to kind of give space to that work, and also seeing things that were very collaborative. And I think that one of the great things about food is that it's messy. It doesn't neatly stay in a discipline. As soon as you're talking about food, you're talking about science and psychology and culture. And so for people who want to be kind of ambitious and expansive in their practice, food is a really great subject. And also I think for people, as a way to kind of speak to your audience, it's so intimate, but it crosses.
And it's something that we all connect to, right? And that
absolutely
kind of cross cultures and
Yeah.
Throughout the world, we all can appreciate sharing a meal together or appreciate food. So it's interesting to see it kind of taken so out of context in a way by some of the artists. How did you find all these wonderful people to work with?
A lot of interesting stuff was happening in kind of the art and design schools, but then we wanted to really mix that up and, you know, look at kind of technological startups, artists who are working with farmers and setting up community drinks companies, and seeing art as a kind of socially embedded practice through to more traditional work that's meant to be in a gallery and that is getting us to look at things differently. So it was actually coming from quite a lot of different areas, and it was 3 years in the making.
Wow.
And I think we kind of probably caused our exhibition designers a real nightmare, because it's, you know, it's a very, very current subject and new stuff is being made all the time. So we were always finding one more thing that we wanted to get in there.
Oh, well, that must have been hard as well, kind of, because there is so much going on in that space that it must have been hard to as well narrow it down to something that was quite focused. And I remember we initially met through Honey and Bunny.
Yep.
Right? And they're doing some really, really interesting conceptual stuff as well in that kind of art food space. What did you work on with them in that?
So they're using kind of performance art to really disrupt the rituals of the table. So they stage eating events. And I think they kind of discovered earlier on in their practice that we're kind of so ingrained in the etiquette of the dinner table, and, you know, what food goes with what and what utensils we use and how you behave around the table, that if you deviate from that, you actually get a very strong emotional reaction from people. So as artists, that's really kind of rich ground. And then more recently, they've been using that to kind of build stories around the sort of sustainability of food. They actually came and did a performance at the V&A a few years ago in our Lavelle gallery, which was fascinating, because I think, you know, food is really disruptive when it comes into the museum. And so they had a table laid out and they were dining, and there were kind of strange medical implements on the table and soil, and so it was quite a strange eating event. But the audience just somehow felt this permission to kind of sort of get in there and, you know, taste the soil and pick up these sharp things in a way that was almost, you know, got kind of quite difficult and uncomfortable, which I don't think would happen with, you know, another kind of installation or performance arts. There was definitely something about eating that kind of invited a much more immediate connection. So that was kind of fascinating. So we really wanted to include them in the show, but obviously it's an exhibition that's on for 6 months in a gallery space.
They were here for the opening, right?
They were, and so they what they did is they came over for a week, and we shot 4 site-specific films around the V&A building, and they staged 4 different eating events. And so it's the film work.
And was
that's
this
shown.
Part of it was at the afternoon tea?
Yeah.
That they did, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and, you know, and it was a really fascinating exercise in kind of sort of stretching our limits for what comes into the museum. So one of them are beautiful architectural backstage staircases that visitors don't see. You know, they brought kind of, you know, barrowfuls of soil in. So our conservation department had to be really open-minded about that one. And then in our ceramics gallery, they de-installed one of the cases and filled it with kind of processed packaged food, and just really kind of sort of played with the kind of thing that normally comes into the museum, and kind of the organic matter that we usually don't cope with.
Is it new bringing food into museums? There seems to be a lot of difficulty, I would say, as a chef, having worked with different institutions, and there's obviously really good reasons as to why.
Yeah.
So did you find that a challenge when even kind of pitching or bringing this idea of food bigger than the plate? How does an institution like the V&A deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, there are obviously some very real conservation issues, and you know, wanting to maintain the security of the rest of the collections. But I think, as you know, in deciding to do this exhibition, you know, we all had to accept that we couldn't do it in a way where we didn't have, you know, organic matter or opportunities for people to taste things, or even things growing. So one of the kind of really fun projects is we've built a mushroom farm in the
yes.
gallery. And we take the coffee grounds from the cafe, bring them into the gallery, grow oyster mushrooms on them, and then they're harvested and they're served back to visitors in dishes in the cafe. So we wanted not just to talk about urban farming or, you know, closed loop systems and nutrient cycles, but actually to set one up in our own building.
And I don't think people realise what a jump that is.
Yeah, and
or how difficult. I think you kind of take that at face value, and you don't realise when you're there at the exhibition. But that's pretty big that that worked out and that they were able to accommodate that.
I mean, we were able to kind of create a completely sealed unit for the mushrooms to be growing in, and it was all vented, you know, out to the outside. So we could deal with the logistics of it. But there is something really magical about walking into the gallery space and seeing these beautiful mushrooms growing. And they grow so quickly that you can actually sometimes hear them popping through the containers.
Wow.
So it is really live. And then it does link back to the Bonigo Cafe in the museum.
Okay.
And that felt really important. And we've done that in a couple of the projects because we could, you know, where we serve visitors food, we needed our artists to be working with their chefs and, you know, and the servers to have the right health and safety training. And it just meant in a really small way, we were mixing up two parts of the museum that never normally meet.
Right.
You know, we serve food in the cafe and we tell people stories in the gallery, but we don't usually cross those two things over. And even in terms of the staff, you know, I now know the manager of the cafe and some of the servers who I'd never spoken to before.
Wow.
So within this institution, that was just quite a nice little testing out of something.
Well, I'm fascinated by that, and what really piqued my interest was I went to the Tate, the Oliver Eliasson exhibition. Wonderful exhibition, and then as I was leaving, I realized that they had taken over the cafeteria, and then I kind of went back and looked into this, and it turned out that was kind of one of his stipulations, that if he was going to do this exhibition, that he wanted to take over the restaurant. And I thought that's amazing, because art, you know, food kind of started off from, you know, many centuries ago as being a subject. Food was kind of a subject of art, and many paintings and sculptures and models around it. Now we're starting to see food being used more as a kind of medium for artists to use it to express their ideas, but it doesn't necessarily have to be neither edible nor delicious, nor, you know, it's not really conforming to those rules. But now it's looking at food as becoming a part of the experience in museums. And that fascinates me as a chef who is so interested in this kind of really rich cross-disciplinary area of where kind of art and gastronomy intersect, and that it's not coming from chefs as much as it's coming from artists as well, that want to not only take people on a great journey through their art, but they also want to involve other senses that maybe had never, outside of kind of haute cuisine and gastronomy and the kind of upper echelons, hasn't really been regarded as a part of the art.
Absolutely, and I think it goes back to, you know, sort of the Enlightenment in the 18th century, where we really started to draw a distinction between, you know, the sort of the mind and the body, and, you know, kind of really privilege sight and text and writing over more kind of physical and emotional responses to things. And I think, you know, we're still very much immersed in that, and certainly that's how museums have grown up. I mean, they can be incredibly rich environments, but they're very visual and they're very static. And
it's amazing because even
you have don't touch signs everywhere.
Well, even with the research that, you know, Professor Charles Spence from Oxford University, who we work with, one of the reasons that he was interested in kind of multisensory flavor perception is because the amount of research that's done in psychology regarding vision and hearing is, you know, way outnumbers the amount of research that's done in terms of things like taste and texture. And it's really interesting that that has carried through even till today in a way that continues.
We don't really know sort of how to sort of conceptualize understanding through taste and flavour, but it is such an important way of interacting with the world and of experience. And if that could be brought into something like a museum experience, I think it's really powerful. And I think also we're just completely missing a trick if we don't do it, because kind of you just know that the kind of conversations people have when they go to the cafe and they sit down and eat and relax and talk about it is very different from that self-conscious interaction, when you're standing in front of a painting and you're worrying about whether you know the right things or what you're supposed to be learning.
That's a very good point.
And all of that. I think that would actually be a way of making museums possibly more accessible, or just not even that, just kind of broadening the range of experiences that we incorporate.
Definitely. So about 3 years ago, we worked with Dr. Roberto Trotta from Imperial College. He's a cosmologist, and we were looking at how you could take, again, in a kind of cross-disciplinary context, we were looking at how you could take some of his science, which is way beyond me to explain, and looking at how you could explain some of these interesting phenomena like the like dark matter or the Big Bang using food as a much more accessible medium for telling these kind of stories, if you will, or for explaining the science in some way. And the most interesting I would say project or activity that came out of that project was when we worked with the Royal National Institute for the Blind. And it was about, because when it comes to astronomy, so much of the way we're fed information is visual. That for those who have sight impairments, obviously that doesn't really work. So it was looking at, can we translate these ideas using other senses to be able, and that's talking about everything from temperature, texture, density, and all these other elements that are relevant in space as they are in the kitchen, and how we could draw upon those to tell those same stories. And what stood out for me most about that was, again, that focus on vision and sound and how they are the senses that we tend to want to communicate most messages in. And as you said, it's that whole idea of kind of missing a trick in terms of there are other senses there that are in some cases more sensitive, you could say. But again, this for me comes down to when you talk about colors, you have Pantones, you have ranges of colors, you have vibrancies and hues and tones, and same with music, you have that whole kind of spectrum of ways of describing it. But when you talk about salty, well, we all kind of assume that it's just one sensation and that we're all experiencing it in the same way. And the interesting part there is we all will experience it in completely different ways.
And we'll all have our own set of memories attached and kind of it's culturally specific and also to our own individual experience. So it's physiologically, psychologically, we will perceive flavor in different ways, but we seem to, and maybe that's why, maybe it's because it's so messy in that sense. With visual things, it tends to be a bit more, maybe it's easier to do. I don't really have the answer for it, but it's amazing. So museums, are they typically known for focusing on food? They're not in terms of as a kind of art, but you were telling me something really interesting about the V&A in terms of bringing food into the building. In the past. Historically, yes. Well, it was the first museum in the world when it opened in 1857 to serve food and have refreshment rooms.
And that's it. We take that for granted now, don't we?
Yeah, it's become the model.
Yeah, and we expect that any decent museum is going to have a cafeteria, perhaps a nicer kind of upscale restaurant in there.
Yeah.
Why had that not existed, and why did it come into? Why did they start that?
I think it was a new idea of the museum as a social space, and it was trying to accommodate a much wider section of society. So the V&A was called the South Kensington Museum at the time, and it actually incorporated what became the Science Museum in London and the V&A. And it grew out of the Great Exhibition, which happened in Hyde Park in 1851. And they had served food there, and it had been a kind of big commercial success, but also helped people to stay in the space and spend longer there. It was also fascinating because for women, definitely for middle class women, it probably wasn't acceptable to go to a public restaurant, but the museum refreshment rooms
right,
would have been
okay.
somewhere that, you know, was considered appropriate. So it opened up a new kind of social opportunity there. They also had a grill room that would serve hot food in the evening, and the idea was that men could go there after work instead of going to the pub, so it was all quite moralistic.
Right, okay.
But it was definitely about this idea of expanding the museum for not just to be for scholars and connoisseurs, but to be for the general public. But there's an interesting flip side, because when museums catered to a smaller section of society, they were less concerned with people not touching things. You know, there are even stories of literally you know, visitors tasting exhibits.
Wow.
Certainly in natural history collections, as a way of understanding and knowing them.
Really?
Whereas as soon as you've got a much bigger museum, then it's you know, you're not allowing people to have that kind of interaction. You can't trust them. You know, you've got to tell them how to behave and give them rules.
And so what's the future of, what do you think we're going to be looking at in terms of food in museums? Will that be something that is going to be more and more of a focus on that? Are we simply going to start knocking on the doors of famous chefs and getting them to open up in there, or is it going to be a bit more creative than that?
I'd really I'd like to see museums continue to explore the idea of sort of multi-sensory and embodied engagement. I think that would be a really exciting direction. Obviously, there's real difficulties to doing it, and you know, we came up against that in the current exhibition. You know, how do you finance, you know, exhibits that have ingredients that need to be, you know, served every day? How do you how do you sensibly approach the conservation issues?
Sure.
But I think it's boundary that is really worth pushing.
So with all the amazing artists that you got to work and look at their work and kind of curate this exhibition, what stood out to you most as a kind of, let's say, theme that you feel is really resonating with people and that you feel is really important that it had to be a part of this exhibition?
Well, I think one that's really, really in the public mind at the moment is food waste. And I think because the exhibition was very much saying that we need to look at food not just as this isolated thing that's on your plate, but as something that is part of a system. And that's very much how designers are wanting to think. They sort of don't want to just make products anymore that, you know, feed, you know, well, basically going to end up in landfill. Then they are thinking about their responsibility in a much wider way, and so waste streams, what happens to a product after we use it, is very current, and that's the case with food. I think actually there are two issues. There's the type of food waste that's, you know, edible food that gets wasted between being produced and eaten, and I think that underlies in a way the whole exhibition, because it's a symptom of, you know, we've come to see food as something that's cheap and throw away, and we kind of don't see the social or the environmental costs in a real way.
Sure.
So I think it's that sort of erosion of, I guess, our sort of respect for food that has turned it into something that's easily disposable. But then also there's a really fun section of the exhibition for me was people kind of doing an amazing amount of research around all the waste streams that relate to food, so human waste and agricultural waste and, you know, sort of food waste itself, and using this as the kind of basis for new materials. So kind of, you know, growing materials from mycelium, and one of the projects uses waste from tea production in Argentina, mixes that with mushroom mycelium and actually grows objects from it. Coffee cups made from used coffee grounds. A leather alternative that's using the sort of husks from pineapple harvest in the Philippines, where the leather production is actually very destructive. So kind of tapping into all these waste streams to make materials that are sort of fully biodegradable and alternatives to plastics.
And shedding a light on parts of waste that I guess people are completely blind to, right? Because I think in the media we know kind of this common figure put out there that about 30% of what we buy for our homes ends up in waste. And I think that a lot of people are starting to become more sensitive to
Yeah.
But I think it's all the other waste as well that's generated as part of the process of getting
Yeah.
to that part that that
We just
final
don't
part
normally see.
we end up wasting. There's plenty of waste throughout the whole kind of chain.
Yeah.
And I think the Bigger Than the Plate exhibition does a great job as well of highlighting that and bringing it to people's awareness, because as I said, I think it's just something that we understand food waste, but I don't think we understand the breadth of it.
And when you start thinking about where ingredients and materials come from and what happens to waste, then you are starting to draw connections between things. And one of my favourite projects in the show is a new material called Totemoxle by a Mexican designer, Fernando Lapos.
Yes, and I'd heard about his work. It was sometime last year, and then I saw he was being featured in the exhibition. His work is beautiful as well. It's really, really interesting.
Yeah, and it works on quite a lot of different levels. So he's created this beautiful veneer out of the husks from heritage varieties of corn in Mexico that naturally come in this amazing range of creams and reds and pinks. So it's a beautiful material that you can use for furniture, for interiors, and it kind of just naturally celebrates this incredible biodiversity of, all these different varieties of corn that were developed over kind of 10,000 years in Mexico. But what happened is that he'd been studying and working in Europe and returned to Mexico and suddenly found that these corn varieties had disappeared from the markets.
Right.
And in the 90s, Mexico started imported hybrid corn seeds and industrial farming methods, largely from America. And that was kind of pushing out the viability of the native corns, which are also kind of vital to Mexican cuisine.
Yeah.
And then the methods that went with that was kind of eroding land, and so lots of small farmers were having to move to the city. And so he saw this really, really big change around the corn, and then found a village that he knew as a child where they were trying to reinstate the traditional farming practices, and decided that by making this veneer, it could provide a second form of income for the farmers. So it made it more viable for them to go back to growing the native corn varieties. And then but they didn't know which ones to start replanting. So then he started working with a seed bank. And suddenly the designer became this link between the farmers, the cuisine, the scientists in the seed bank, and the design market where this product was, is now being sold. And I just think that's it's a really fascinating way to think of a design process, is that kind of bridge between, this indigenous knowledge, the science, the flavour. So he's working with essentially a waste material, but that's led to this really deep engagement with agriculture and cooking and seed bank.
And I think food waste is so topical at the moment as well, partially because it's interesting. You're right, we have devalued food in so many ways, but we live in a time of plenty, right?
Yeah.
And we have, over 800 million people around the world that are considered malnourished in the sense of not getting enough food. But then the bigger problem that we have in the world is malnourishment in terms of people eating all the wrong stuff. And partially, as you said, there's biodiversity that plays a role in this. But I think the food waste part is interesting because we're constantly seeing people talk about this idea of 2050, 9 billion people, how are we going to feed them all? I think for those who look a bit closer or kind of scratch the surface, you see that actually we could be feeding the 9 billion people on Earth today. We have all the resources. A lot of it comes down to how we're distributing that, how we're allocating that, and the choices of what foods people are eating. And it's not just about getting enough food to people, it's about what food are you getting to them, because it's no good. Well, you obviously want to stop the 800,000 plus people who are malnourished because of a lack of food, but whether that's by giving them the same diet that people in more developed countries are now consuming that is actually eroding health and causing all sorts of kind of social issues. I think that's where why maybe food waste as well is a really interesting topic, because it has an even, it's not just about wasting a resource, it's also about looking at kind of future generations and looking at those who are starving and those who are malnourished, and how we can try and do something around that.
Definitely. I think it's linked to a sort of an erosion of our sort of literacy and understanding around food. Certainly, you've got a best before date on something, and you're going to just believe that rather than judge for yourself whether something is still good to eat. And a lack of knowledge of nutrition. And I mean, actually, it goes back to another interesting V&A story, because when in the 19th century version of the V&A, there was actually a food museum, and this was on the science side. Right. And it was about communicating the brand new science of nutrition. So German chemists were kind of uncovering the chemical composition of food. Mm-hmm. And then this gallery was an attempt to tell the public about that. And so, I mean, it must have at times been pretty horrible, but you had a pound of lots of common foodstuffs laid out in the cases, and then little bottles that showed you comparatively how much nutrients you got, so you could kind of compare and see whether you'd get more energy from potatoes.
Where's that information
or bread.
Now? This is what we need now.
I know.
This is what we need to educate people on these days.
Well, we've it was almost like the kind of the first version of a nutritional label, and we've got the old catalogues that show you how that happened. But in a way, it was there because I guess London had just expanded like so quickly, and people had left rural situations where they had a very hands-on understanding of food and local food culture, and then were sort of working in factories in the city, and then they were being given this kind of food by numbers understanding, or whoever came to the gallery was. It was interesting because it was a real shift in thinking about food through numbers and science, and definitely no pleasure involved in that gallery. You go to the V&A cafe at the time, and the menus actually sounded quite good, but then if you kind of crossed over and went into this food museum, it definitely wasn't about enjoying your food. It was about getting maximum energy to make you a good worker.
Yeah, sure.
And I think where I was getting to there is sort of, I guess, something we were very conscious of in the exhibition was not separating the kind of the issues from the pleasures of food, and
right,
and kind of thinking about actually the ways in which some of the industrial approach to food that's kind of prioritizes efficiency and increasing production often does that actually at the detriment of flavor and pleasure, and and also kind of getting further away from enjoying seasonality or having some hands-on connection with growing, or having the confidence to experiment in the kitchen, and all those kind of pleasures that if you only see food if you only have a very passive relationship with food, you're actually, it has implications for the environment and for nutrition, but also for your enjoyment.
No, I couldn't agree more. I mean, you mentioned a few things there that really resonate in terms of the senses and how we relate to food. At our chef's table that we host here, we're constantly looking at this idea of getting people to be more mindful of the sensory interaction with food.
Yep.
So much of what we take for granted is kind of erodes, I believe, in a way, our enjoyment of food, and that in turn can lead to excessive eating or not eating the right kind of diet. And it's interesting because you mentioned there that idea of not even with produce going by sell by date or best before dates. And there is that loss in terms of the sensory connection that we have with food, to be able to tell when milk is sour rather than have to read it off a label. And I've spoken to a few people about this idea, and I think that idea of reconnecting people with the sensory pleasures of food is really important. And that's interesting these days because, again, it's interesting with food that what was a really, or what still is a really kind of multi-sensory, enjoyable process of kind of engaging with food, mediums like Instagram have turned it into, again, a much more visual enjoyment of food, in terms of we derive, it would seem, an awful lot of pleasure out of food porn these days, and it seems to be huge on various social media platforms. And again, I think that's indicative of this idea of the growing degrees of separation between us and our sources of food, and the fact that now we're living in a time of plenty, let's say, globally, that we've maybe to some degree, because I think 100 years ago, people would have found it very hard in most cases to appreciate food as art.
Yep.
Beyond your kind of Escoffiers and Carems and the chefs cooking for the kind of royalty, let's say, when they were doing these wonderful, extravagant dining experiences and parties. But I think the general public would have found it very difficult to see food being used as a medium in art. But now, because in the last century, how much more there is and how much more plentiful it is in terms of food, that in a way that's shifted culturally, where we're starting to become more and more accepting of seeing food as not just being represented in art, but food actually being used as art, right? And I think that a lot of that has to do with the fact that despite us looking at the world in terms of there's a limited amount of food and how we're going to feed a growing population, at the same time, I think we're comfortable enough to
play with food.
And I don't think that's something that, even if I think about my grandmother's generation, that wouldn't have been something that was necessarily okay or acceptable, or and I mean on a moral level in a way, because there are starving people. I grew up being told to finish my plate because there are starving kids in Africa. I mean, you know, that
me
was
too.
So and I think kids probably still are being told that. And it's not that there aren't now starving children and adults in many different parts of the world, and it's not that those issues aren't serious and need to be taken care of, but it's interesting that culturally we seem to now be in a place where we're okay about seeing food used as art, and I think that's kind of given rise to exhibitions like this as well.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting distinction between sort of plated food as an art product in some way, or thinking about the actual process of cooking as something creative, because something that several of our artists talked about was people like Michael Rakowitz or Karen Guthrie, Jaslyn Kaur, who've kind of have got sort of fine art careers. They take their first experience of creativity back to being in the kitchen with their mother, and seeing that as an inherently creative process, and being about intimacy and expression and care and all these things that they've wanted to reintroduce into their artwork. So I think, absolutely, in the past it wouldn't have felt morally right to play with your food in some respects, but perhaps that kind of everyday creativity of just kind of getting food on the table and all the skill that actually involved, very often from women on a sort of daily basis. I guess it's about what you count as an artistic process, and how we value some processes and not others. So, is someone painting different to someone creating food? I mean, you can probably argue it lots of different ways, but it's interesting that culturally we prioritize some forms of creativity and value them, and don't see others.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, it's even when you look at kind of gastronomic creativity and artistry, let's say in the culinary realm, I mean, again, you probably only have to go back 100 or so years ago and find that no one really gave a damn who was behind the stove and cooking up these wonderful creations. That wasn't important. Most important thing was it was good food, it tasted good, it was good value for money or whatever it may be, but it wasn't really being judged until maybe in the West in the 70s really is when it started to become that people started singling out. And there were celebrity chefs, that go back to the 1700s, but I'm talking in terms of just general perception of people being interested in who's actually producing the food that they're consuming. And now we've gotten to a point, if you fast forward to 2019, where shows like Chef's Table on Netflix and Mind of a Chef, and now people are really interested in the thoughts and philosophies and
Yeah.
ideas that are driving chefs in a way that they're now being seen as artists, right?
Absolutely.
In a way that they had never been considered before. And in the past, it was all about the maitre d', really. If you go back 100 or so years ago, it was the maitre d' who knew your favorite table, knew what well, no one had allergies then, but knew what you did and didn't like to eat, and was the one who was the showman and would, toss your Caesar salad or mix your beef tartare or whatever it may be, flambe your crepe Suzette. But now, and we can see this in even the layout of kitchens, like so many more open kitchens now, people want to see the action. Even if you look at our chef's table, people love being at a table where it's all chefs surrounding them and serving them and explaining the ideas and philosophies behind the dishes. And that is really new in a way, in terms of that's only an occurrence that, let's say, in the last 20, 30 years and in the last 10 that's become really mainstream, that people want to know more about where this food is coming from, and not just the food itself, but the creativity behind each of the dishes. So will we see a V&A exhibition of chefs? You're just immediately
I would love to think how we could
nightmare.
do that. We'd have to have you all camped there for months on end. But no, it's interesting because I think it's artists and chefs are crossing over in both ways. So a number of years ago, Ferran Adria was invited to do something for Documenta, one of the kind of big prestigious contemporary art festivals, and so that was definitely a statement of that creativity being on a par of what else was being shown. But then you've also got artists who are interested in food, and this definitely goes back to the kind of 70s and people like Joseph Byers, who want to reintroduce art into everyday life and revalue just the kind of simple creativity of the everyday and seeing beauty in that. And so it's the crossover goes both ways, and I think that's really healthy.
Well, so you mentioned it, and I think that was a landmark moment for the Ferran Adria being involved in it was Kassel, right, in Germany, where they hosted that. And am I right in saying he was the first chef who had been invited to any kind of major art exhibition on that scale, right? And I think
definitely
part of what they had done is so I've read about this, and I believe that one of the things that he said is, if I'm going to exhibit my art, it has to be in my restaurant. And so I think they would select people to go over, wouldn't they, to El Bulli and experience his art form at the restaurant. Am I right?
I can't remember whether it actually, you could be right, whether it actually went back to El Bulli, but it was definitely a separate restaurant to the rest of the festival. So it was sort of conceived of as a separate pavilion in that, but you had to travel to it.
And that was amazing, because that seemed to be one of the kind of first times that chefs and culinary arts have really been accepted into the kind of real art world, let's say.
Yep. And actually what I think is happening now is actually interesting collaborations happening with scientists, chefs.
So we were talking about Honey and Bunny earlier, and one thing that struck me as well that's really interesting about kind of when you were talking about their approach towards food, and you used a really the right word for it, which is disruptive. And I find as a chef that's, and especially because of what we do in the kind of realm of multisensory design of experiences, that it really does, as a chef, there are so many traditions and norms and conventions that we don't want to break with. And it's really interesting when we look at food artists, how they're so willing to break with those conventions. And it's inspiring in many ways. And it's not to say that there aren't chefs who are willing to break with the norms. I mean, I'm not quoting verbatim here, but Andoni Luiz from Mugaritz, I remember hearing something along the lines of him saying, when I was at culinary school, they taught me how to cook delicious food, and now, after all these years, I want to cook interesting food.
Yeah.
And Mugaritz is probably one of the first restaurants that I at least know of that really had this philosophy of they wanted to pursue what they found interesting. They wanted to look at areas like disgust and really understand the emotional relationship that we have with food. And this is something that you see a lot more coming from artists, as you said, but it's really interesting that we're now opening up to a lot of these ideas. And as chefs, we're willing to be maybe a bit more disruptive as well in that sense.
That's really interesting, because you imagine a restaurant scenario is that you're wanting to please people with the food. But there's such a big range of responses and emotions that you can get from people, that if your diners are willing to go on that journey, that's really interesting.
And I think now so again, one of the dishes that we've just recently put on our menu is looking at fear. Because we thought, all this emotional engagement at the dining table, we want people laughing, we want them enjoying, want them surprised, want them, maybe even not disgusted as much as maybe challenging themselves with certain textures or certain flavors in a way. And that would only be in kind of, in a very controlled way. But then we thought about fear tends to be an emotion that gets overlooked at the dining table. And it's really interesting to see that now in this kind of modern day restaurant world that we're pushing into the boundaries of all of this. But I think a lot of it does start with these kind of food artists who are themselves being disruptive.
It sprang to mind Michael Rakowitz's projects. He did an event at a restaurant in America, and it was a dish developed with a chef, and they used date oil that came from Baghdad, but it didn't. Okay. It said it came from the Netherlands, but it'd gone on this kind of journey, and that had been scrubbed out, but it was from Baghdad.
Right.
And then it was served on plates that had been looted from Saddam Hussein's palace and then acquired on eBay. And so he was talking about the fact that normally restaurants use provenance as a way of making the diners feel good about this lovely story about where their food comes from. And it was like, no, I wanted them to feel uncomfortable. To make in that instance, it was a very definite political point. But it was just interesting that just when he said it, I actually want the diners to feel uncomfortable, which is normally not what you're going for.
No, definitely, and I think that's all part of why people want to go to different and new and interesting dining experiences, because we've had the all really nice, really, sit down, white tablecloths, very smart and formal. And that's still, there's a huge market for that. And I think we can all appreciate that at different points. But I think there's a real hunger out there now that people want to experience things with food in ways that they haven't before.
Yeah, and I think that actually that word experience is key, and actually that links back to what we were talking about kind of Instagram and digital experience.
Yeah.
Because I think as more of our lives are enacted in digital spaces, there seems to be people who are less focused on stuff and things as a way of telling people who they are, and it's more about kind of collecting experiences. And I think that's partly why so much food gets photographed and put on social media, because it lends itself to that. You're showing people the experiences that you're having rather than the things that you have.
I agree.
And I think people are more interested in that kind of pursuit of new experience.
Yeah, definitely. You had a question for me.
I did, because we were talking, something that's really struck me from working on the food exhibition is just what a brilliant subject food is for collaboration and crossing over boundaries between disciplines. So as a chef, are there artists who you want to work with, and what would you gain from that?
Oh God, yeah. Where do I start in terms of artists I'd like to work with? Well, first, I got a note that we worked in 2014 with Erison Lex, who's an amazing artist based in New York. He has really strong Japanese influences in his work, and we had worked on designing a 9-course keiseki themed experience that drew lots and lots of inspiration from his work, both in terms of the materials used. He used a lot of ink, and so we were kind of really fascinated with using ink and gold and other elements that get used in the kitchen, but maybe just kind of made us rethink how to approach using those kind of ingredients. And that's one artist that we have worked with, but someone that I'd like to work with, let's say, of the living artists. Well, I went to the Saatchi Gallery a couple of weeks ago and saw, I don't know if he would call himself an artist, he's definitely a musician, but James Lavelle, who is, I believe he heads up the Mo-Wax label. He had done an exhibition at Somerset House a few years ago with featuring kind of Stanley Kubrick's works, and he curated an exhibition around Stanley Kubrick's work. And his current exhibition, Beyond the Road, at the Saatchi Gallery is fantastic. He's great at creating these really immersive experiences with amazing use of light and sound and the journey that he kind of moves you through. And I think because of the nature of the work that we do at Kitchen Theory, it would be great to work with someone like that, who I only felt, the one thing I felt was missing was a gustatory element. But yeah, so that would be the kind of artist that I'd really like to work with on, because I do think that given that we're in London 2019, that there's still a lot more room, and there's a lot more hunger out there from the general public, or a growing hunger for really immersive multisensory experiences that are curated by, I do believe that the future of dining is about more than just celebrity chefs. I think we're going to see, just as the maitre d' was maybe the star of the show, as we talked about earlier, 100 years ago. Now we've got celebrity chefs, and they're the ones that, people will, travel to go to their restaurants and experience their art. I think as we move forward, that will die down a bit, and what people will start to really value is these really interesting collaborations that start to come out. So I think in our case, maybe it's the chef and the psychologist and the artists, and working in groups like that to push the boundaries of how we represent food and how we engage people. So yeah, I think that's definitely, in terms of how I would see the future of restaurants, it's great to go to a restaurant that's got an amazing chef behind the stove, but it's even better if you know that there's an interesting story with the architect and the interior designer and these psychologists who's worked on all the audio kind of engineers who have designed the soundscapes. And I think that is going to be increasingly part of what attracts people to great dining experiences.
Oh, it's a theatre that you're a part of. Then it's kind of
exactly and I think this idea of kind of food-utainment, that people want more than a meal, and the whole idea of a meal and a show kind of goes back a long way, but maybe being, rather than being a passive thing where you're kind of watching this show and consuming a meal, that you're actually a part of an experience. And again, one really interesting note here that springs to mind is at Mugaritz, that I mentioned a moment ago, they had done a dish with Ben Hogue, who is a composer, and he had designed a dish with them where at some point in the meal, and not everyone is at one table, people have come in at different times and they'll be sat down, have a meal, but at some point in the meal, everyone would get served this one dish. And you'd lift it off this kind of a glass cloche, and it would play a type of music. And in some way, you would get this din through the room of everyone's kind of piece of plateware in some way kind of coming together. And that kind of shared food audio experience, I think, is, again, it makes you as a diner, rather than it being a kind of passive thing. Because I think as chefs, we're probably, I see it as we're one of the only art forms where without someone to eat your food, your art isn't complete, right?
Yep.
You have to have someone consume it in order for it to be a good piece of art. Otherwise, it just, and I think bringing people together as well, that was a really kind of unique way that they had done that. So what's happening with, what's the future with the exhibition? When is it on till? When can people catch it until?
It's on for a little while longer, until the 20th of October.
Until the 20th of October. Where can they find more information?
On the V&A website.
Amazing.
And there's various extra bits and
I was going to say,
interviews and articles.
are there any as well activities going on between now and then?
We've got some things happening around London Design Festival,
Okay.
particularly on the kind of materials research side of things.
Cool.
We're also going to have a symposium on the 11th of October that's kind of digging in a little bit into the art science crossovers that can happen with food. So we've got some interesting people coming to that to sort of think about how those collaborations can work and what can come out of them.
And so now that you've is this the first exhibition you've curated around food?
Around food, yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so will it be is it the beginning, the first of many, or is this like, I'm done with this messy world of food?
I think that it would be brilliant for the V&A to do more things around food, but coming from different angles. And I know this particular show definitely relates to my interests in the kind of intersections of art and design, society, politics. But actually something that was really great right at the beginning in the first conversations with this project, which actually were with our previous director, he said, don't get caught up on it having to be the food exhibition. You wouldn't think like that if it was a paintings exhibition. You wouldn't do the paintings exhibition.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
So it's such a vast subject. There's so many different ways of looking at it. And I also, exciting things that we could do with programming. One idea we had that we weren't able to realise that would be brilliant if we could do in the future. We have fantastic ceramics collections. We actually have a kiln in the gallery, and we wanted to pair ceramic artists and designers with chefs to come up with a joint meal, and to possibly use the kiln to cook in. And then we quite liked the synergy between the process of particularly baking and working with clay and doing some interesting hands-on stuff with that. So maybe a few more events things that we could pursue.
Awesome. That's I'm looking forward to the follow-up. Catherine, thank you so much for coming into the studio and sharing all your insights with us, and the wonderful
pleasure.
And the wonderful kind of stories about the V&A as well. I'm fascinated by the science, kind of food science museum that was there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.